thanks to everyone. I know there are others joining us as we go along here. Welcome to this, obviously, this webinar about our legislative updates. Let me start out by saying I know that there are people that have joined this webinar that are critics of the AKA. I know that some of you have some beliefs that Kratom is somehow responsible for some of the tragedies in your lives. I understand it. There is nothing that anyone can say that will in any way deal with the grief that you may or may not be feeling. And I know that legitimately, there are some who believe that Kratom is the source of their problem and the problem of a loved one that perhaps was deceased. There's nothing we can do to block you from participating in these meetings or even to be disruptive if you choose to do so. But I just wanted to open the meeting by telling you that what we believe at the American Kratom Association is that all public policy decisions should be based on science. And what we have done is made a good faith effort to examine the science about Kratom. And you do not have to trust the American Kratom Association. You can look at the independent evaluations that have been made by deliberative bodies to determine whether or not Kratom possesses the characteristics that are associated with scheduling of any substance. The evaluation was first made by the Drug Enforcement Administration of the application made by the FDA filed in a Federal Register notice on August 31st of 2016. The DEA, after they had evaluated public comments that were submitted, and by the way, in that Federal Register notice, the section of the Controlled Substances Act that was used was the emergency power section that did not allow for any kind of public comment or evaluation. It was a 30-day notice, and then it went into effect. And so it was a very limited ability, but despite that restriction, the DEA was pummeled with thousands and thousands of comments and objections that were being raised, and not just by Kratom advocates, by scientists and public policy officials who raised legitimate questions about whether or not the FDA's claims were accurate. And that led to an unprecedented withdrawal of the scheduling recommendation by the DEA in 82 previous submissions by the FDA and others for there to be a scheduling notice. And when it got to the Federal Register notice for that publication, none had ever been rescinded. That was the first time in 82 previous tries that the DEA had voluntarily withdrawn the scheduling recommendation. They did so because they believed that the information that had been provided by the FDA was insufficient. So at that point, the DEA asked for two things. One, they opened a comment period that allowed the public to formally comment on the proposal for scheduling of Kratom. There were 23,231 comments, I believe. They are public record. You can go and read them. The second thing that the DEA asked was for the FDA to provide a complete 8-factor analysis of the request for scheduling of Kratom's alkaloids, metrogenine and 7-hydroxymetrogenine. That analysis is a full and complete dossier of all of the published scientific literature that is available in order for the DEA to evaluate whether or not the substance that is under review should be scheduled in Schedule 1, which was the request made by the FDA. They told the FDA that they wanted that updated 8-factor analysis delivered to them by December 1st of 2016. That would have been roughly 3 months after they had originally proposed what's called the emergency power section, where they only had to prove 3 factors. So the FDA didn't do it. We had AKA had a pro bono offer from Dr. Jack Henningfield, whom everyone knows is an experienced expert who had worked for the National Institute on Drug Abuse for decades, who understood what was required by the 8-factor analysis, who produced an 8-factor analysis meeting the criteria required by the Controlled Substances Act, and it was submitted within the deadline that the DEA had set for that. So that's one evaluation, and no action was taken as a result of Dr. Henningfield's 8-factor analysis, which reviewed all of the evidence and included the evidence that the DEA had included in their original recommendation that was not necessarily complementary of kratom. Now, what has happened since then is the FDA did submit a full 8-factor analysis on November the 17th of 2017, roughly a year and some months after they were requested to actually produce it. That evaluation was undertaken by the DEA and at the request of the then Chief of Staff of the Department of Health and Human Services by the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Joie, to evaluate whether or not the legitimacy of the claims made by the FDA were sufficient to justify a scheduling. So the reason that's important is that this was the second tough scrutiny that was placed about kratom and whether or not it met the criteria for the Controlled Substances Act, which needs to have a specific evaluation of 8 factors, and they can be consolidated into the safety profile of kratom, its pharmacological action, and whether or not there's an approved medical use. In the case of kratom, the only question about approved medical use would first be required to be, the threshold would have to be met by the first 2. Is it being used as a medicine or being actually being advertised for sale as a medicine? And we strongly support any action by the FDA to interdict any kratom manufacturer who is marketing their products, making an illegal therapeutic claim. So that dossier was submitted. The DEA started to evaluate it. When Dr. Joie evaluated it at the request of the Chief of Staff at HHS, whose responsibility it was to clear all new regulations at the department, Dr. Joie came back with a scathing letter to the FDA, wherein he told the DEA commissioner he was withdrawing the formal recommendation for kratom based on inadequate science, emerging science that contradicted what the FDA's position was, and that there were scientists who disagreed with the FDA's premise. Then he laid out the framework for what the FDA would have to prove in order to justify a future scheduling recommendation, and then made the warning that millions of people would be at risk if they were to ban kratom that were currently using kratom as an option for the management of acute and chronic pain. And that those people would then be forced back into the more dangerous realm of products like opioids that have a known addiction profile and a known safety record that calls into question whether or not they're the most appropriate way to do it. When Dr. Joie removed that consideration and withdrew the recommendation for scheduling, the FDA had lost twice in that process. The National Institutes of Drug Abuse also did their own independent evaluation as to whether or not the scheduling recommendation with the data provided by the FDA was sufficient for them to sign on. And the bottom line was that they determined that the National Institute on Drug Abuse, using the gold standard for evaluating the abuse liability, determined that there was no significant abuse liability to metrogenine or 7-hydroxymetrogenine. And that was confirmed by 2 independent studies that were done by contractors under strict standards by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. That, in addition to the evaluation of the claimed deaths that were associated with kratom, which the FDA originally said was caused by kratom, then morphed into associated with. When they evaluated those deaths, the NIDA scientists came to the conclusion that all of those deaths were either polydrug use or adulterated kratom products or underlying health conditions. So at the end of the day, the requirements for scheduling were not met. And now you have the FDA alone being the advocate for scheduling of kratom. When HHS withdrew its support, when the National Institute on Drug Abuse withdrew its support, you have the United States Congress in the last 3 appropriations bills giving report language saying don't ban kratom, that people are using it for good effects, and the science documents that. So when we arrive at the position that we're in today, where critics of kratom claiming that it's highly addictive, that it is dangerously addictive, and that people are overdosing on kratom, that's not consistent with the scientific record. And I've addressed the addiction liability. When it comes to the question of the, 1 second, Kurt, I'm sorry, Mark, you need to send Kurt Bramble the Zoom link because he needs to get in on this. And he just texted me. When you look at the question about the safety profile of kratom and its pharmacologic action, we know, and it is widely reported and accepted, that metrogenine and 7-hydroxymetrogenine do bind to the mu opioid receptor in the brain. We know that. There are many substances that do, including chocolate and cheese. In fact, there's a peer-reviewed published article about the effect that cheese has in binding to that mu opioid receptor and how it hits the pleasure center, which is that euphoric high that opioids give you. And that's why pizza is such a popular consumer item, because of the pleasure effect of the cheese that comes from it. Kratom binds to that mu opioid receptor like many other substances. It does not bind the same way that opioids do. In fact, it is characterized by scientists with peer-reviewed published literature that prove that in effect, it binds partially. It doesn't bind in the same way as an opioid does, and it does not go to the euphoric center of the brain, which gives you that reinforcing high that accounts for the addiction profile that so many people claim the kratom has, but it does not. It also does not travel to your respiratory system to suppress it. So you don't see overdoses in a traditional opioid-like fashion like you do with opioids. And you do not see people coming back to use kratom because it doesn't induce that euphoric reinforcing high that opioids give you. So for those people, and I know you're on this call, for those people that believe that they have a loved one who passed away because of an addiction to or an overdose from kratom, they need to look closely at the toxicology reports. They need to look closely at the analytical data that's provided. And if you haven't done it yet, you need to get a full tox screen. You will find that in every case that has been documented by the FDA and NIDA and the Centers for Disease Control, that the reports from the medical examiners document that there's polydrug use, and they talk about adulteration of kratom products. And here's the problem. And we're sympathetic. We understand that it's a problem. And we at the AK fight hard against it. And that is that there are adulterated kratom products that have fentanyl, morphine, and heroin. You can look at the CDC report, and that's what they identify as the primary adulterants or substances that are present in a tox screen of decedents where kratom was detected, meaning that the person took kratom, but it's not kratom that caused the deaths. And even in the 7 deaths that were identified by the medical examiners as being kratom only, when the CDC did a sophisticated analysis of the blood samples in 6 of the 7 deaths, they had blood samples available. They determined that it was polydrug use or adulterated kratom products. It is possible that someone is using a kratom product that has been enhanced synthetically of the alkaloids. In other words, those alkaloids are given more power than what the natural plant provides for. And if that's the case, that is by definition legally an adulterated product. So to those people that rail against the AKA for defending this product that's dangerous, I can tell you that the science contradicts that claim. I can tell you that there are people that are being helped by kratom that are saving their lives. And I've listened to thousands of people across this country testify in public hearings talking about how kratom has improved the quality of their lives or saved their lives. But I know that there are people that believe that the loved one has passed away from a kratom addiction and or an overdose related to kratom. And if that's the case, it's an adulterated kratom product. Now, I do not maintain, and I know the scientists don't, that it's not possible that you could behave in such a way that kratom can possibly create a death. We believe in responsible consumption. It is true that you can overdose on many, many things that are common commodities. Water is an example. You can drink enough water in a short period of time that will upset your electrolytes in your body, and you will die. No question about that. You can look at the data that shows that addictive personalities, people that have psychological problems, can probably ingest whatever they're taking, and particularly if they're taking an adulterated kratom product, they will have an overdose, not because of the kratom, but because of the adulterants that are added to it. And if you want to look at the science, look at the FDA. The FDA claimed that there were 44 deaths associated with kratom, originally claimed that were caused by. They cite, even today, in their most recent 8-factor analysis, the 9 deaths in 2009 that occurred in Sweden in a 12-month period. That cluster of deaths, that shorter period of time, let's have at it. That's a dangerous substance. And they identified krypton, a powdered kratom product, as the common substance that was used by those people who died. What the FDA does not acknowledge is that there is a peer-reviewed study published in 2011 by Swedish scientists, and it went through rigorous review that all of those deaths were caused by an adulterant that was added to those kratom products, O-desmethyltramadol, which is the chemical used in the production of the opioid tramadol. That same dose in a cup of coffee or glass of orange juice in the morning would kill you. So to suggest that because adulterators are putting in those substances into kratom, that kratom should be banned doesn't make any sense. And when you look at the scientific data that evaluates the risk profile of taking kratom versus opioids, for example, and by the way, if your loved one allegedly died of a kratom overdose, likely they're going to go to opioids. You're have 1,000 times greater risk of having an overdose of opioids than you ever would of kratom. When you look at the safety studies that are done, you can consume hundreds of times. Animal testing has shown that hundreds of times what you could consume in a day. The animals prove that there's no deaths and there's sedation, which is expected, but the oxycodone control showed that those animals are dying at even lower doses than what kratom provides. And it documents that there's a safety factor here that is being misstated by those critics. So I feel badly for families that have lost loved ones. I feel badly for those of you who are on this call tonight and you expected to come here and hear a fight. I will agree with you 100% that if a person died from ingesting kratom, an adulterated kratom product, that the bad actors should be found. We fight hard every day. We do not fight for kratom to be legal if it's adulterated or dangerous. We fight for consumers to have the ability to help themselves to improve the quality of their lives without interference from the government. And the best example of that is the Johns Hopkins survey of adult kratom users that asked those users why they use kratom. And for those that were using it for the purpose of weaning off of opioid addictions, they found that 87% reported a reduction in their withdrawal symptoms. That's a major problem for people getting off of opioids. And they found that 35% were opioid free within a year. That's called harm reduction. That's called a good public policy. And so you then have to look at the abundance of evidence that's been published since 2018, when Dr. Joie gave his scathing withdrawal letter and rebuked the FDA on their science, their poor science, their disappointingly poor science and evidence. And then you have a pretty clear case. Then you look to what happened in the latter part of 2021. The FDA took its case with some other member states under the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, saying that kratom should be banned internationally. They have a lesser standard for scheduling on the international stage. That review was conducted by an independent review panel called the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence at the United Nations, WHO, and they're completely divorced from politics. They voted 11-1 that there was insufficient evidence, even under the lesser standard, for the scheduling of kratom. And they looked at every claim made by the FDA. They looked at every scientific report that the FDA claimed justified their position. They looked at all of the published literature, and they came to the same conclusion that the HHS has come to, and that the National Institute on Drug Abuse has come to, and that the US Congress has come to. So I don't know what to say to those critics that keep claiming that we're in the business of trying to promote a dangerous product. We're trying to promote a safe product that is sold in its natural form without those adulterants, and that's properly labeled, and that is restricted in terms of age. And that's what we're about. We want to protect your families. We want to do everything we can in order to help you. There is a responsibility of an individual who engages in the consumption of any product that they have to use it responsibly, because there are outliers that none of us can control. There are other factors that are mental health related and that are physiologically related that may be a problem if you're taking kratom along with some other substances. But as a general rule, in the way that we regulate products, we don't decide to ban a product because someone was abusing that product inappropriately. You don't see bans on water because someone could overdose on it, nor any other substance. And we even allow things that do kill people, which includes things like alcohol and tobacco. So I wanted to start off because I can tell you that these attacks that are ramping up on social media, for those that are here tonight listening, and I know you are, you should hear this message and know that we're trying to help. We're not trying to hurt. We will work with the patient advocacy groups. We will work with addiction recovery centers. And I can tell you that on that front, there are people that are coming into the addiction recovery centers that are attributing their problems to a kratom use disorder. I understand that. If you are abusing any substance, including kratom, you can become dependent. You need to look at the literature, however, which documents the actual activity, activity of the alkaloids, and you will find that the withdrawal profile, because kratom is from the coffee plant, is much like you would experience with a caffeine addiction. And by the way, caffeine's deadly if it's taken too much of it in a compressed period of time. It is the same addiction withdrawal or a dependency withdrawal, which is about a week to 10 days of an upset stomach, a minor headache, and a runny nose. That's what happens. And we feel for people to go through that. They don't have to go on to other FDA-approved drugs in order to get off of kratom, unless they are, of course, experiencing withdrawal from other substances that they may be taking concurrently with kratom, or they're taking adulterated kratom product. So that I'll stop there on that explanation, but I thought it was important to get out there because I recognize some of the names that have shown up here tonight that are a part of this group of critics that are pushing here. And I am glad to talk. We'll organize a Zoom call. I have challenged some of these critics who are on this call tonight to a Zoom call, and they refuse because they don't want to confront the truth. They want to spit out their narrative of negative information that is inaccurate, untrue, and not justified in the science. We're open to these discussions, open discussions, and you can take me at my word that I'm glad to participate in those discussions if you're willing to do so. Our purpose here tonight, however, was to give you an update on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act and how we were doing in the States. The reason that we are as successful as we have been in the States with overwhelming votes when we have the opportunity to express these views to legislators and back it up with science is that we see strong votes in favor of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, because what we are doing is protecting consumers. Where kratom is completely unregulated, there's a problem because of the adulterated products, and both in terms of adding dangerous substances or enhancing the natural alkaloids. Nature got it right, and it ought to be kept that way. I can tell you that the only objections that we hear are based on old science that Dr. Joie identified that is provided by the FDA, which they continue to repeat today. The FDA has not changed its narrative one bit, even though their best case has been rebuked by and repudiated by the major governmental institutions that are there to evaluate and keep them honest. And there's no explaining away why, if it were true that kratom was killing people, if it were true what the FDA claimed in 2016, that we would have thousands of people dying in the streets if we allowed kratom to remain on the marketplace, we are now 6 years beyond that. And we're not seeing any deaths that can be positively identified as kratom only. All we are seeing is the claims that are made by people that the FDA somehow is smarter than the rest of us. So, and they have to prove it. And it's exactly what Dr. Joie said to Dr. Gottlieb when Dr. Gottlieb complained about the withdrawal letter. And he claimed that kratom was an opioid, which is not true, unbelievably not true, and claimed that kratom was the gateway drug to opioids. And Dr. Joie said it perfectly. He said, if you believe that, prove it, because there are ways to prove it with good science. And right now, there's been no effort by the FDA to meet that challenge going forward. So as we talk to these legislators and we tell them that we're there to help protect their constituents, to make sure that we can eliminate from the marketplace these bad actors, there are kratom vendors in the United States who are selling products that they should not be allowed to sell. Now, they're doing it in two ways. One, they're making impermissible health claims, claiming that kratom will cure opioid abuse. It will relieve fibromyalgia pain. It will cure any number of things. Those claims can only be attached to products that have gone through the new drug application process. And unless there is an NDA that has been reviewed by and approved by the FDA, you can't make those claims. We at the AKA have reported over 60 kratom vendors that we have documented with impermissible marketing materials that make therapeutic claims that are illegal under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. When those kinds of reports are made to the Food and Drug Administration, they immediately issue warning letters and they take enforcement actions against the vendors because what they're doing is illegal and putting the public at risk. We know that when a kratom vendor says that you can buy their kratom, and some of them say we're 10 times more powerful than the plant, That's an adulterated product because they've either enhanced synthetically enhanced the alkaloids, or they've added a controlled substance that gives you that powerful strength, because we know the pure kratom does not do that. So in that sense, they're flat wrong, and that we have to be in a position to explain how the FDA's narrative is so far offline and not justified in the science as we go forward. So that's what we try to encourage these legislators to do, to make sure that we're not allowing these bad actors. We have referred more than 60 of those vendors over the last 18 months. There has not been a single warning letter, not even a warning letter, much less enforcement action taken by the FDA. Does that tell you where the FDA is? They're not interested in protecting the public. They're interested in furthering their regulatory agenda, where they want to have complete and total control over kratom, a natural plant. And natural plants by themselves are not safe by virtue of being natural, but you have to look at the alkaloids and what they do and what their pharmacologic actions are. And kratom in that context is acceptable within the safety profile that is applied to substances like kratom and alkaloids that are the content of the plant. And that's why I've been as strong as I've been to correct the record about what we're for. We would eliminate, through the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, the introduction of any kratom product into the states that pass it that is contaminated, that is adulterated, that is synthesized, the alkaloids are synthesized, that isn't properly labeled and doesn't go through the GMP process that's required for good products. And we should eliminate every one of those bad actors. And I would guess that it may be as high as 65 or 70% of the kratom vendors in this country do not adhere to those standards. I'm for cleaning up that marketplace. I'm all for it. And I would join hands and stand shoulder to shoulder with any critic of kratom that wants to clean up the bad actors, because then you would see that kratom could be available to people to actually help them. We know that there are, in the kratom marketplace, about a third of the people that use kratom like you would a cup of coffee, because it gives you an energy boost and increased focus. Another third use it for anxiety relief, and some claim that helps them with dealing with addictions to alcohol and that kind of thing. And then that third that are dealing with acute and chronic pain, that are managing that pain through either opioids or other dangerous substances, have found relief from it. So that's what we advocate for, and nothing less than that. That's why we get this strong support. When you see states like Utah passing it 24-1 in the Senate, in Georgia 164-1 in the House, and 50-0 in the Senate, in the Arizona, both houses, in Nevada it was unanimous in the Senate, in Oregon when it passed last year, unanimous in the House, and I think it was 24-2, something like that in the Senate, and the governor vetoed it. But she only vetoed it because she didn't want the regulatory body, the Department of Agriculture, to be the administrator of it. She asked us to switch it to business and occupation, or licensing occupations. We've done that, and I think we're going to get good success out of Oregon because it passed overwhelmingly last year. In Missouri, we got blown up at the last minute because of an unrelated Medicaid issue when the Senate adjourned without taking action on bills. Same thing happened in Texas, where they adjourned because of the dispute between the Speaker of the House and the Senate President. They left 120 bills on the consent calendar, which are the Kratom Consumer Protection Act was on. In earlier this month, in January 5th in Wisconsin, we had a hearing with the State Affairs Committee in the House, and we had a robust hearing. They heard from the law enforcement officials, they heard from the state crime lab, and they heard our presentation from the American Kratom Association on the benefits of the KCPA. They passed out in a 9-2 vote a repeal of the current ban and a passage of the KCPA. So we're making great progress there. We're seeing that happen in other states as well. In Vermont, the effort is ongoing. In Rhode Island, we're making good progress there. So in the states where it's been banned, and banned because of the disinformation that the FDA provided between 2012 and 2016 that induced those states to enact bans, we're now seeing that the states are revisiting that. And Vermont officials told me that they thought it was a terrible mistake to have banned it in the first place. So I think that we're getting to a position where there's more acceptance of this position, and particularly because we are asking for controls. For those that criticize the AKA, criticize the KCPA, the alternative is a completely unregulated marketplace, because the science does not and will not justify scheduling on a national or state basis because it doesn't meet the criteria. And the only rational choice is to regulate it to get rid of the bad actors that are in this system right now. We're seeing great progress in a number of other states as well. It was exciting to see that in the state of Hawaii, we had the Speaker of the House and the Senate President sponsor the KCPA. In the state of Washington, Senator Honeyford introduced a bill to ban kratom, and we had a great discussion with him, and he's listened to the people. He just filed a new bill that is the KCPA, and I think he's going to strike his ban bill. We're making progress in Kentucky where we see a ban bill that's popped up. In Mississippi, a much more difficult area because of the misinformation that has been spewed out by the FDA and by a local anti-kratom group. There are two ban bills, but the KCPA bill is also there. So we're hopeful that reason will prevail. In the state of Florida, we had a hearing on the Senate side. It unanimously passed that committee for referral to the Senate floor. Well, actually, they go through two more committee hearings, and then they go to the floor. In the state of Ohio, we had a great committee hearing, and you should go on and watch it because I think you'll see the power of the arguments and the science and the evidence that's presented. And I think we're going to do well in Ohio. We have in Illinois, we've got the bill filed. We've got it. I testified in Kansas yesterday. I think we've made our great case. And in every one of these states, the legislators are concerned about what they hear about kratom from the FDA. And when they evaluate those fears against the evidence and the proof and the science, they see the light here that this is a way to protect consumers as we go forward. So some of you may have specific questions about the specific states, and I'm glad to answer those. I'll go through some of the Q&As that are on here now, and I'm going to invite David Carlucci and Jeff Laredo to also comment as we go forward here because they're on our team. And I think Senator Bramble may also be joining as well, and he's absolutely able to do this. So let me go through some of these questions. Where is the power to regulate kratom within the Constitution? Wouldn't this be a clear 10th Amendment issue? The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act allows for the federal government to enact a scheduling decision that is specific to a product that meets the criteria. And there are two ways to do it. One is the emergency scheduling, which temporarily schedules something. The FDA tried that in 2016, a lesser standard, but they couldn't even meet that. And then the full 8-factor analysis, which the FDA cannot meet. But the constitutional issue is really different here when it comes to the way that kratom products are marketed. Because if you are a vendor, you are prohibited from free speech that an individual has. In other words, you can't induce the public to buy a product by making false claims or claims about therapeutic benefits. And so the court law, the case law there is very clear. Vendors are restricted. But the bottom line is that an individual citizen who finds a product that helps them or benefits their health and well-being are perfectly free to use that product for whatever purpose they choose. And that's the constitutional issue that gets involved here. So Brian, I hope that answered your question. Melissa, you asked, what is the difference between natural kratom, pure kratom, raw kratom, and liquid extract kratom related to safety and permanency? The science here is clear. The natural kratom product grows as a plant in Southeast Asia and now growing very successfully in Florida, is a natural plant that contains about 40 alkaloids. Pure kratom is that plant that is properly processed in order to ship it to the United States by grinding it into a powder that's free from contamination of E. coli, salmonella, and other microbes that could potentially be dangerous. They're not indigenous to the plant, but they are introduced in the processing of those products. The liquid extract kratom, and how does it relate to safety? And I'm not sure I understand what permanency means, maybe dependence. But extracts are an important issue here. If a product is manufactured into a bottle form like this, and it has all the proper labeling on it, and if it is an extract of the metrogenine content, in other words, it mirrors the content of the actual plant itself, where less than 2% is 7-hydroxy and 66% is kratom. That is a pure kratom product that's safe. And actually, when you do it this way, it's a little safer because it has been processed in a way that eliminates every potential microbial that might be available in the plant itself. You can have acceptable levels of salmonella in a botanical plant. It's when it reaches a critical mass. So that's the difference along the way. Now, if a product like this is bottled and it is enhanced synthetically, that's a dangerous product, but so are capsules. And so are powders that are also extracted. They can be just as dangerous if they are improperly processed and spiked with either an artificial enhancement of the alkaloids or with an adulterant that has different effects than the pure plant has. So I hope that answered your question. Then I see a Kentucky resident. Can you elaborate on the proposed bans in Kentucky and the timeframes involved? Further, can Kentucky residents, what can you do to help? So we're going to be calling upon Kentucky residents to reach out to their legislators on this. We have spoken with and had great conversations with the sponsor of the ban bill. I think that he is interested in helping. I think right now he's sticking with his bill, but I think that the people that are working around him are going to opt for a safer alternative than a ban, because Dr. Joie said it right. When you ban it, you create the risks for people of dying, and that's the way it is. Melissa asked another question. What do you tell people who have kratom dependence with more than just withdrawal symptoms you talked about in Ohio? Melissa, I wish you had the courage to come on with me and talk in a Zoom meeting. I offered it. You have not agreed to it, but I can tell you that you don't have to believe me. You look at the science, and the science documents that the kratom dependence that we're talking about is exactly what I described in terms of its effects, its pharmacological effects. It is not the same as an opioid dependence or addiction. It is not. And the science proves that. And I talked about it in Ohio precisely to document that the science should rule here. And there is no science that says the kratom has the same dependency or addiction levels that opioids do. And in fact, the science contradicts it directly that it does. And even though you may believe in your heart, and I accept that you do, that kratom is somehow dangerous, it's not. And even an addiction recovery specialist called me several years ago, who runs a group of addiction recovery centers in Virginia. And he actually provided a commentary on this, where he said, when I started seeing people come in with kratom dependence, it worried me. And I started to look hard at what kratom was. And he said, I'm an opponent of kratom at the time. He said, but after I saw and listened and heard and saw with experience that kratom was actually helping people, and when they showed up with so-called kratom dependence, they were actually in the midst of trying to get off of other substances they were on, and the kratom helps. And he believes now that it should be used in the treatment options for people that are suffering from dependence. So this is something that's going to require a diligent look at science. It will not be solved by name calling. It won't be solved by spewing lies about what the AK is doing. And it won't be called by trying to demonize us when we're trying to help you and your families and everybody that's suffering in these problems, because I want to, and I know the American Kratom Association wants to, create a safer environment for everyone that is using kratom, particularly those that are using it in order to wean off of dangerous opioids. And so I wish, Melissa, you had the courage to go on to a Zoom call where we could have a reasonable discussion about this. And I'm disappointed that you haven't responded in the way that I thought would help us to move forward. Then the next question, actually, I'm sorry.
Mac, this is Jeff. Can I make a comment, not about Melissa's comment, but about the science in general?
You may.
For those of you who, some of you on this call know me, some of you don't, but I spent the bulk of my 30-year federal career working at the National Institutes of Health, and most of that time working at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. NIDA's job is 110% science. And as a science agency, they're actually quite conservative in the way they talk about things. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting to me during the time that I was there and in the 3 or so years since I left NIDA, is the distance that the scientists at NIDA, led by their director, Dr. Nora Volkov, have come on the kratom issue, not only in terms of funding more and more research, but in the way they've both publicly and privately talked about the compound mitragynine, and quite frankly, privately talked about their disagreements within the federal establishment with the FDA and initially with the DEA. That's a big deal. The reason that I mention it here tonight is because a very careful, relatively conservative, research agency within the National Institutes of Health, the gold standard research biomedical research agency in the world, if they have moved so far in our direction, to state it colloquially, They're not running around being kratom advocates. They're running around being research and science advocates. And as researchers and science advocates, for them to be actively disagreeing with the FDA, as we are, is a really big deal. It is a really big deal. They don't do that lightly. And I feel strongly that we should be paying attention to that. Gee, yeah, not just because they happen to agree with us and we happen to agree with them, but with whom they disagree. And for that information to be out there, and for us to be able, sometimes out in public, sometimes quietly, behind the scenes, to see that disagreement, tells us a lot about our science-based position being correct. It's not about opinion. I don't care what anybody's opinion is on this. What I care about is what we know and what we don't know. And that's why we fund and advocate for funding research, to figure out more and more of what we don't know. And what we do, every bit of information now that we've been collecting on things that we do know has supported the potential safe use of this product. So I just wanted to add that as a former Fed and former, not a researcher myself, but a policy supporter of the researchers.
Thank you, Jeff. That's very appropriate. And maybe it's a good time for David to kind of explain his journey on kratom here, because I think it's instructive to the point that you just made, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Mac. And thank you, everyone, for participating tonight. And I want to thank Mac, because as someone that believes in kratom and the good things it can do, we have such a passionate advocate. And I was just with Mac and Dr. Henningfield in Ohio. And these two gentlemen are just like the Energizer Bunny. They're so passionate. And we spoke to numerous legislators. We spent an entire day marathon session talking to lawmakers. And I think that's the key. I'm a former state senator in New York. I spent 10 years in the Senate. That entire time, I was the co-chair of the Addiction Task Force. And we had different iterations under Republican leadership, under Democratic leadership. I served under each of those leaderships. And when I first learned about kratom over a half decade ago, the information I was getting was just sporadic from the FDA and some media reports. At that time, I was concerned, and I put in legislation that I thought was appropriate at the time to ban kratom in New York. The silver lining was that I started to hear from real people, because people saw that bill and they said, Senator, you can't do this, because this is what kratom has really done to me. It's helped me. It's turned my life around. It saved my life. And I heard numerous stories. And I tell that story because I believe that when we talk to lawmakers, we have to tell them, we have to show them the science and the data, but we have to provide them with real life stories. And I see the chats today. And this is something that we've heard over and over again about those testimonials, about what kratom has really done. And I'll tell you, that's what moves politicians. Yes, you see the data, you read the reports, but when you hear out of someone's mouth that you know and respect, and someone in your community, a constituent of yours, that it's telling you, hey, this helped me. I tried other things, but this is what's helped. Those are the stories that need to be told. And I think it's appropriate that you reach out to your lawmakers. And what's important is to be as polite as possible, and come at them with educating, because most people have no idea what kratom is. And our biggest obstacle when it comes to regulating and getting the Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed is that education, is just having an open mind towards what kratom is, what its dangers can be, and what its positives are. And when we have that honest dialogue, when we have that open conversation, when lawmakers are willing to listen, we win. And we get that message across, and we're able to get the KCPA passed, which means safe access to kratom. Because we know Mother Nature got it right. Kratom in an unadulterated form helps people. We've seen it over and over again, and now the science is proving it. So my message tonight is we can all do our part, and the biggest part we can do is share our story and make sure that whoever your lawmaker is, make sure you know who that person is and make sure your state lawmaker knows who you are. And it's easy to do that. Look, I represented about 300,000 people, but not many of those people actually called my office. The ones that did got the attention. And I think that's what the important thing is yes, we need the support from the American Kratom Association because we need to put the message in front of the lawmakers and have the reports and the science done. We also need you to tell your story. So everyone can do their part. Everyone knows what they can do. And we need to do that. So make sure you pick up the phone tomorrow, call your state legislator, and make sure at least they know what your story is and what they can do to help.
And thank you, David. Amen to that. Everybody should do that tomorrow to call their state legislator and say, even in states that don't currently have the KCPA, they should call. And by the way, we wish that we had the resources that we could go into every state. We're not able to do that. And there are states that we know need to have the KCPA, but we just don't have the bandwidth, the money, and the kind of resources that are needed to do that. We're doing the best we can. We're in about almost 30 states this year where we've got some activity going, some defensive, where we're stopping bans, and some that are promoting this. Some of these states are going to require a year or two to get acclimated, get the information out there. I've been on calls all day with various states and finding that there are some challenges. There's some resources out there that we really are able to use effectively and that we're going to be adding to. We think that the first thing I hear when I go to a legislative hearing is that the legislators will say, I've never heard of kratom until I saw the word in this bill. And they don't have any idea what it is. Then they do what most people do. They say kratom. Well, let me Google that. Now, Google's probably the worst place in the world to get any information about kratom, but it's getting better. We did a survey of the references in published articles about kratom and contrasted it to the 2019 to 2020 period against 21. And we found that what was characterized as negative articles on kratom at about 91% in 2019 and partially into 2020 turned the corner where it's now down to about 61% are negative and the others are more positive. We're starting to have a dramatic impact on the understanding of the mainstream media about these issues. And I think the fact that the science keeps racking up. Now, this is an interesting area, by the way, that I should have mentioned earlier. When we talk about science, and Dr. Giroir said it, emerging science is proving that the FDA's claims are wrong. There are two things at play here. One is that there was early science that raised questions about kratom because they were looking at the data that was being submitted, and these researchers looked at it and said, well, what should we do? And they started analyzing it, and they always ended, and you'll see this in virtually every published article, we need to have more studies on it. Well, those more studies have yielded a far greater understanding than the earlier studies. For example, they say, well, we need to have more study on how the alkaloids of kratom actually bind to the mu opioid receptor in the brain. But right now, and this is studies from 16, said we think that it is causing euphoric highs and we think it's causing respiratory suppression. And we need more study. Well, the more study revealed that that wasn't true. The more study in 2018 and forward shows that, in fact, it doesn't have any significant impact on your respiratory system, and it doesn't touch the reinforcing euphoric high system in your brain. So that's what science does. And so when someone says, oh, well, science from 2016 is just as valid as what's being published in 2022, frankly, that's nonsense. And the other distinguishing character, the second issue, is that when you evaluate science, you first have to look at whether it is a commentary or a case report. That's important because if you have a case report that says patient presented himself, says he's using kratom and he has liver dysfunction. Now that's a case report and that's all that is. A true research project or a scientific research project looks at broad numbers of data where you have multiples of cohorts of populations are being studied, and you look at the Southeast Asia research where they've had kratom that's been used in high doses for centuries, and you look at their data and they're seeing that there is no organ dysfunction by the use of these long-term high-dose kratom users. So I don't know what you do other than evaluate the quality of the science and look at it from a quantitative standpoint. And it's the point that Dr. Joie made that's so powerful as you go along here. So I just encourage people to evaluate the scientific record in that context as you go forward. I don't know whether Kurt joined us or not. I want to give him a chance to speak. Kurt, are you on? I know he was traveling in southern Utah and he may be in a bad area, but if he does join, we can ping him to talk as well. So one thing I'd like to, before we open up to questions, is just conclude with this. We are doing our very best at the AKA to present the scientific evidence and to make the public policy argument that is derivative of that science to create the safest kratom environment possible to ensure that pure kratom products are legally accessible to the populations and that the appropriate regulatory safeguards are put on it. The alternative, given that it cannot be scheduled under the law because of the appropriate regulations that require that a scientific standard be met for scheduling, the only other option is to allow kratom to be sold like the Wild West. And that's where the adulterators will rule. That's where people will be put at risk. That is where you are in this position as being at risk, and we want to eliminate that. Mark, by the way, Kurt says he doesn't have his link for being a panelist. He's only a participant. So if we can get that to him, he would like to make a comment. So that's the nub of this issue. We are trying to reduce risks. We are trying to evaluate from a public policy perspective how we can advocate for reducing risk and increasing safety for those consumers of kratom to assure that they are not going to be in a position of unknowingly purchasing a kratom product that is dangerously adulterated. We want to do the best we can, at least as we can on this. So I think that that's something that everyone should consider when they start to criticize. We are not perfect by any standard here at the AKA. We do our very best that we can in this effort, and we're always trying to find the new evidence, the new pathways for people to have a greater understanding. There has been an updated 8-factor analysis that has been assembled by Dr. Henningfield and his team at Johns Hopkins University, where they now have more than 100 new scientific research published articles on kratom that will be available in this 8-factor analysis, and it's going to be published any day, but you can certainly get it from us at the AKA, where it will, in fact, show you the scientific record and address each of these issues. And even for those critics that have suffered the loss of a loved one who want to believe that kratom was the sole responsible party, to those people, I can tell you that while it is likely that it was an adulterated kratom product that caused this death, I can't rule out the possibility that something else happened, that by taking kratom, that it caused a unique reaction in the individual's physiological response to kratom. Maybe it did happen, but I would not trust, if I were anyone, a medical examiner making that conclusion, because as we have learned in close examination, and in fact, working with one of the largest labs in the country that do the medical examiner and coroner's toxicology screens, they tell us that they only test for the substances that the medical examiner asks for, and each one of those tests has a cost associated with it that increases if they ask for more substances. And what they are seeing is that based on the FDA's disinformation campaign, these medical examiners are only asking for kratom and 1 or 2 other products because it's cheap to do that. And the fact that kratom is detected in the bloodstream of someone who is using kratom does not mean that kratom caused the death. And the fact that the medical examiner didn't ask for a full panel, even though it may be more expensive, isn't good science if you then say, oh, kratom was detected, therefore it's the cause of death. And you don't have to look any further than what the FDA's claims were on one of their 44 deaths, where they said it was a kratom-caused death. And when the autopsy was revealed, and the FDA did everything they could to hide it and to deny access to it, it took an enterprising reporter to extract it. And what they found was that the death that had been withheld from the FOIA request that we made, the one of the 44 was in fact a young man who was in the middle of a drug sale, and the police ordered him out of the car. He refused, and the police shot him. He died of 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, and the coroner's report documented it as the cause of death. But kratom was detected in his bloodstream along with a number of other illegal substances that he was using concurrently. Maybe kratom was helping him get off of those. And the FDA called it a kratom-caused death. That shows you the extremes that the FDA will go to in order to justify their campaign against kratom, and how they have misled, I would say, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people into believing that kratom is an unsafe product. So I ask you, if you're one of those critics, take a close look and examine this as best you can. I see Kurt's on, so I'll turn it over to him to give a statement to the webinar. Then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Mac. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're doing fine.
Great. I don't have a robust enough Wi-Fi to get video, but I really appreciate all the comments, particularly former Senator Carlucci's observations. You know, when I started this journey on kratom, I was a skeptic. Mac introduced me to the idea. I was a skeptic. That was in 2018. But the more I dug into the real science, not the anecdotal, not the reported that I think someone might have had kratom, but the actual clinical studies, the actual lab reports, it became the toxicology reports and such, it became clear that kratom has some real potential. But when you're reaching out to legislators, and I've been now involved in this as the sponsor of the first Kratom Consumer Protection Act in the nation, and doing a significant amount of interaction with the government of Indonesia and in other areas around the world, it is clear that the most powerful approach, if you have the accurate science, that's great. That lays a foundation. But then telling people's stories or telling your own story about how kratom has affected you, there is no substitute. You know, I've received now, we ran the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in 2019, 3 years ago. I've now received several thousand emails from citizens, not only in my Senate district, not only in the state of Utah, but literally from around the world, testifying that what kratom did in their lives. Now, yes, there are critics. There are tragic stories. Here, Mac mentioned that you can overdose with water. In my Senate district, about 10 years ago, parents were charged and convicted of involuntary manslaughter. They were disciplining their young teenage daughter by drinking water. They forced her to drink so much water that she died of an electrolytic imbalance. So when Mac said you can die from water, that actually happened in Springville, Utah, about 10 years ago. That's not the issue. The issue is pure plant safe? And, you know, the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, it really is a pretty easy sell if you start out from the premise there are 6 states that ban kratom. We understand that. We understand why they banned it. That means there's 44 states where kratom is considered a nutritional supplement, a nutraceutical. It is unbanned. It is not banned. It is not scheduled. And I'd say now it's unregulated. That's not true because there are a growing number of states that have followed Utah and are now regulating kratom. But if you're in a state where it's legal but unregulated, to the harshest critics, which are you better off? Having it regulated so it can't be adulterated with fentanyl, benzodiazepine, tramadol, morphine, or all the other types of chemicals that it can be adulterated with, and it's those adulterated products that are killing people. Are you better off at least having pure plant, having independent lab certification, and having the product labeled so that citizens know what they're getting? And as the science unfolds, you've heard from several now, from Mac, from Jeff, the science, every month we're getting additional information. New white papers are coming out proclaiming the potential benefit of kratom in its pure form. So we're on a quest here. This is political hand-to-hand combat to get the story out. I'll finish with this. Law enforcement in some states are proclaiming that kratom causes driving under the influence, driving while intoxicated, driving while impaired. This week, I spoke with the superintendent of Utah's Highway Patrol. Now in Utah, our public safety, our Department of Agriculture, they did not oppose the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. Why? Because there was no evidence in Utah that people were abusing kratom. There were no reports. So now we're 3 years into it. Kratom has been legal, but it's been regulated. We have the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in place. We have our Department of Agriculture registering the products. They're overseeing the lab tests, repository for the independent lab tests. They have the ability to investigate and such. So in the last 3 years, I asked the superintendent of our highway patrol, head of our public safety, how many complaints have they had? How many stops have they had? How many incidences have they had in the last 3 years where kratom was involved or where kratom was even suspected of being involved? And the answer is none. And I think that's playing out in every place where we're being effective moving the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. So Mac, thank you for the time. I'll go back to mute.
All right, Kurt, thank you. And I'll conclude with just an example of how this battle, how this quest, as Kurt put it, how important it is. And that is, I traveled down to Pearl River County, Mississippi last week to testify at a local county hearing that was looking to ban kratom. In fact, had voted to authorize the drafting of a ban ordinance there. And the reason I went there is that Mississippi is a hotbed of anti-kratom activity, and I wanted to make sure that the record was clear about the accurate science that they had been misled about in their prior hearing where they had discussed kratom, and I'd seen a transcript and listened to that hearing. And I gave pretty much the same pitch that I've made here tonight. The sheriff of that county was asked by the president of the Board of County Supervisors to give his opinion. And the sheriff described that while I was speaking, that he was texting to the Drug Enforcement Administration official that oversees the Gulfport, Mississippi office, asking him about the status of kratom. And the sheriff explained that the reason he had gotten up and left the meeting was that this individual called him to tell him what the status of kratom was. And he told him, this is what the sheriff reported to the Board of County Supervisors on the record in a public meeting, that in fact, the DEA had banned kratom in 2016, and that ban had taken effect, and that the kratom was banned by the DEA under the Controlled Substances Act until 2018, when they decided to suspend the ban because they wanted to look at more science, and that was the fact. That is not the fact. Not a single word of that is true. It's inaccurate. The record shows clearly that the DEA withdrew its scheduling notice, which had been up for 40 days, because of the science that they saw that contradicted what the FDA said. There never was a ban imposed under the Controlled Substances Act for kratom because the science doesn't justify it. And yet a public official in the form of a sheriff in a county in Mississippi reported to the Board of County Supervisors this inaccurate, distorted information about kratom, and who knows that they won't act on it. And that's the problem. And that's why I'll go to Pearl River County. That's why I'm sincere about having a meeting with or a Zoom call with the critics of kratom, because I think we have common ground in most cases. We want to protect their families. We want to make sure that the people that have struggling with addictions and that are using kratom, and that maybe they're using an adulterated kratom product, maybe even there's the outlier. And I acknowledge that it could happen, that there's an outlier, that people are actually died of kratom because of some interaction that's unrelated to the pharmacologic action of kratom, but may have been a contributing factor. We need to research those things. But for there to be a knee-jerk automatic reaction because the medical examiner detected kratom in the bloodstream of the individual, or even concluded that it was based upon an overdose or a high concentration of metrogene, we don't even know what a deadly level of metrogene would be. So for a medical examiner to make that judgment is really responsive to the FDA's disinformation campaign, inconsistent with the CDC's research is, and it contradicts the science on kratom. So that's why I think this discussion needs to continue, and that where we identify these areas where there may be outliers, let's appropriately regulate it. Let's find ways for people that present to an addiction recovery center with a true kratom addiction that's kratom only, and it's not an adulterated kratom product, and it's not a synthesized kratom product that become adulterated by enhancing the power of the alkaloids, then we need to investigate that. But we haven't seen those cases yet. And when we do see them, then we need to look at what is the appropriate treatment regimen. But pharmacologically, it is not the same as an opioid dependence. It is not the same recovery period. It is not the same methodology that should be employed in order to help that person. So those are the important arguments that can come from a reasonable discussion. It can't come from name calling and taking shots on social media pages, which is probably the worst place on the planet to get good and accurate information. Yes.
Mac, let me way back in just for a minute, because you touched on something. We testified in one of the states where it's banned, where kratom is a scheduled drug. And in that state, the law enforcement, the sheriff testified that they had stopped several driving while impaired drivers. The kratom was incredibly dangerous, and that it had to be banned. And in his testimony, he said that because the toxicology lab did not screen for kratom, they couldn't prove it, but they knew that kratom was involved in a significant number of impaired driving incidences and accidents and such. Immediately after the testimony of the representative from the Sheriff's Association, the director of the state toxicology lab got up and testified and said that because kratom is a scheduled substance in their state, that they screened for every scheduled substance, and they had not had one incident, not one, where kratom was the sole component in the toxicology report. And everyone where there was an impaired driver, it was due to other substances known to impair the physiology, known to impair an individual when they're driving an automobile. Directly contradicted the representative from the Sheriff's Association, who had claimed that they didn't screen for it, but they knew that kratom was a source of a significant number of driving under the influence or driving while impaired. The toxicology lab said, hold it, we screen for everything that's scheduled in our state, and we have never, not once, in the time that we've been screening, have we seen a case where kratom was there as the sole component of a driving impaired. So thanks, Mac.
Thank you for that clarification, Kurt, because that's an important thing. We see this disinformation that then becomes the reality on social media, where these kind of statements are made. We had a similar situation with a medical examiner in the state of Idaho who called us out of the blue and reported that he had had a death in which the individual had died of hypothermia. And when they did the tox screen, he had an alcohol level that was very high, and because he had come out of a bar and fell into a ditch and literally died in the middle of a snowstorm in Idaho in the winter. Also had some other illegal substances in his system and had kratom. And so he listed it as a death with hypothermia. When the report was circulated, the FDA called him and said, you need to call this a kratom death. And he said, why would I do that? And they said, well, because he had kratom in his system. He said, well, it had nothing to do with his death. He was inebriated and intoxicated, went out and dropped into a ditch and died of hypothermia. And the FDA threatened him that they were going to go to his superior to overturn his ruling that it was a death caused by kratom. That's what we're fighting against. And the FDA has demonstrated that it's willing to go to great lengths. And when you have the world's best scientists evaluating whether kratom is the kind of substance that's schedulable as argued by the FDA, and they have found that it's insufficient evidence to document that, when you see the HHS Assistant Secretary for Health, who is an independent arbitrator, who himself said, I'm not for kratom. I don't advocate for kratom. I'm telling you the FDA is wrong on their science. That's what we're really dealing with. So we've taken a long time here, and I apologize. Let's open it up for a couple of questions if someone wants to raise their hand. And Ryan, I'm not sure how we moderate these questions, but
I'll go through them, Mac. No problem. And just to sum up a few members joined late. If you can just do a quick recap again on Washington, Kentucky, and Idaho.
So Idaho were stymied by the Republican conservative group that controls the Ag Committee that doesn't believe that we should have any regulations. They're not against Kratom. They're just saying we don't want any more regulations. So we're having to work carefully with them to try to encourage them to do it. State of Washington, Senator Honeyford filed the ban bill. We've had great discussions with him. We had an unfortunate problem where some of our advocates kind of got a little bit too aggressive and made threats to him. He was very unhappy about that. But after we had the discussions, he was very reasonable. And he now has filed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act and indicated that he will strike the ban bill, which means it will be dead. And he's hopefully going to pursue the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. There's an issue about timing in the state of Washington as to whether a hearing can be convened before the cutoff date. And if that happens, we're going to have to come back to Washington next year. But they were actually doing pretty well. What was the other state that you were interested in?
Washington and Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky, we have a ban bill that's been introduced. We have a KCPA that's ready to be introduced. We've had discussions with the sponsor of the ban bill, Representative Callaway. He's a very reasonable guy, but he just sort of locked and loaded because some constituents who are in the addiction recovery space have weighed in with him. He is not going to be an influencer there. He's a brand new legislator, just doesn't have the SWAT yet, but he's willing to work with us on the KCPA as well. So we're appreciative of that. Not so much a threat. Mississippi is the most significant threat to a ban bill that we've seen since 2016. So we're going to continue to work there in Mississippi.
All right, thank you. And then let's see. Is it known for sure why the FDA is so hot and heavy for Kratom? I know common talking points are that pharma companies want it gone, but wasn't sure if that was entirely the case. Great information. I really appreciate you guys.
So this is an interesting area of discussion because there are some theories that it is because of pharma companies. I think the reality is two things. One is the FDA has had a long-standing bias against all botanical products that have therapeutic benefits experienced by consumers, and they want to regulate those as drugs. That's just the business they're in. The ancillary beneficiary of that policy is a pharma company who's not going to be the least bit interested in entering a marketplace and conduct the 10-year study and the multi-billion-dollar research that's necessary to get an NDA when an individual can just go out in the marketplace and buy the natural plant in the form of kratom and have the same effects. It won't be as precise and in terms of its deliverable as a synthesized pharmaceutical product. And then, of course, it'd be restricted only by prescription from physicians. So I think that that's the FDA's bias. They evidenced that back in the early 1990s when they tried to ban all dietary supplements in the United States and vitamins, forcing them into the new drug application process. At the time, the FDA was absolutely correct that there were poorly formulated and adulterated dietary supplement products that were killing people. They were right, but they were wrong to blame the dietary supplement. It was the fact that they didn't have regulations in effect that controlled the production of those products. And today, if the FDA had their choice, they would repeal the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act that has been in effect since 1994, has served the American public. It's a $53 billion industry. 85%, I think the latest survey showed, of American families use dietary supplements to manage their health and well-being. And it's the same story with kratom. They're just trying to do it. If you were to have a candid conversation with FDA scientists and some policymakers, you would find that they are astounded by the position taken by the commissioner's office with kratom. There is an individual, a high-level individual who's an influencer who weighed in with Gottlieb and other members of the leadership at the FDA that has led them down this path of disinformation. It's unfortunate, but it's the way it works. And we're hopeful that, having lost 3 times now with the original scheduling request in 16, in the withdrawal in 18, and now the WHO rebuking their efforts, I hope that the FDA comes to their senses and turns around here and works with us in order to properly regulate and protect the American public.
All right. Well, thank you, Mac. No, I think that sums up the majority of the questions here.
Well, good. And let everybody stand by. Do two things. Call your legislator in the morning and tell them your personal story and tell them that they ought to support the KCPA. And if there's not one pending, they ought to encourage it to be filed. And we'll be glad to cooperate with them. And the second thing is for everyone to stand by. There are going to be actions in your state that we're going to ask you to intensely weigh in on. So be alert for those things and understand that as we activate these advocacy efforts, we're also exposing ourselves to the criticism of those, as I said, who are on this call tonight, who are intensely negative about Kratom. We should be respectful to them. And I've tried to be, and I know I was a little strong about it, but I think it's important to kind of reset the narrative, but be respectful. We're not in the business of trying to attack people. We're not in the business of trying to threaten them. We're in the business of trying to get good science to dictate public policy that protects the lives of Americans. And in this case, we're on the side of the angels when it comes to this effort, and we ought to be open to recommendations and additional regulatory standards that could be imposed that would protect the public further. So thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. There'll be a video of this up online shortly. So thank you.
Mac, I'm sorry. Do you just have a couple minutes to talk about Wisconsin and Florida regarding the KCPA?
Excuse me. Yes. Wisconsin, they passed 9-2 out of the State Affairs Committee. And excuse me, and it'll go to the House floor. In Florida, it passed unanimously out of the Senate State Affairs Committee, I think it was. And we're looking very good there. People are understanding the need for regulation. So both of those states are looking great.
Great. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.